Hello, everybody, and welcome to Lunch and Learn. I'm your music director, Scott Speck, and I have a very special guest star with me today. Normally when you hear this man speak, it's to talk about things like the upcoming concert, upcoming events, and different milestones. For example, a change in regulations. So now we can take off our masks. Yay! It's Andy Buelow, President and CEO of the West Michigan Symphony. Welcome, Andy.
Thank you.
You know, Andy, of course, is in many ways the face of what's going on with the symphony, but I thought you might want to know something about Andy himself, because he's a fascinating human being. We've been friends since about 2013, so 8 years now, quite amazing.
Yep.
And you've been President and CEO here for now about 3 years?
Yeah, a little over 3.
A little over 3. So, but what a lot of people may not know is that you have very deep roots in this area. In fact, from early childhood on, you've sort of been in this basic area, and even had another job in Michigan before coming here. So tell us a little bit about your childhood and your illustrious musical background and all of that.
Okay, well, my childhood began in Davis, California, where my dad was a music teacher at the University of California. But very early on, he became enchanted with Davis, and we...
Enchanted or disenchanted?
Disenchanted.
Yeah.
Did I say enchanted?
You said
disenchanted. Disenchanted, and took a position at Lawrence University in Appleton, Wisconsin. So we moved there when I was 2. So I really think of myself as, well, you know, because we would always spend our summers in Traverse City, where my family has a summer home we still have today. So every summer we would take the ferry across the lake, and we'd spend the entire summer at our cabin north of Traverse City, and then in the fall we would take the ferry back and go to Appleton. So I like to say I'm a native of Lake Michigan.
Right, exactly, from the whole area. But very interesting to me that from the earliest childhood you spent a lot of very formative time in Michigan.
Yeah.
In West Michigan specifically.
Yeah, it really got into my blood, and in a very tangible way, it just became home. And so no matter where I've lived in the world, I've always wanted to be back here.
Wow, what luck. Here
Yeah.
you are.
Here I am. Well, exactly.
That's so great. Tell us about your musical upbringing. I think that's fascinating.
Okay, well, yeah, as I mentioned, Dad was a professor of music, pianist, and he described himself as a piano teacher first, a composer second, and I can't remember what came third. He was an organist, I guess, as well. Maybe that came third. Anyway, so I grew up in a household where classical music was always present, always there, and also some jazz. You know, so I grew up listening to Duke Ellington and Oscar Peterson.
What about rock?
No rock. Rock was verboten in my household, but
Now wait just a second. Okay, if rock was verboten in your household and you were, a budding teenager or whatever, you must have rebelled.
Oh yes. I rebelled and became a fan of acid rock, 1970s acid rock, Alice Cooper, David Bowie. But then I also started listening to progressive rock, Yes, and Emerson, Lake and Palmer, and Pink Floyd, and things like that. And Emerson, Lake and Palmer did these rock adaptations of classical pieces, like Copland's Hoedown and Fanfare for the Common Man. And that got me curious to go back and listen to the originals, all of which, of course, my father had.
So in spite of yourself, you found yourself gravitating toward what your father wanted for you.
I couldn't stay away from it. That's
There is this gravitational force of classical music. It's quite something. Wow, wonderful. And now you're a keyboard player yourself. And you have, I've seen, Andy has quite the collection of keyboards, not just a piano, but synthesizers and organs of various kinds.
Right.
Tell us about that.
Well, I still have my very first organ, which was this little Whitehall combo organ. Combo organs were something that came around in the 60s. They were basically based on transistor technology, so they sound very tinny. You know, if you listen to old Doors albums or Iron Butterfly, those are combo organs. And
so the famous organ solo from Light My Fire, is that a combo
that's
organ?
a combo organ. Yep.
Fantastic.
And then in addition to that, I have several digital organs, and then I have a Moog Voyager, which is a recreation of the mini Moog synthesizer.
And the Moog synthesizer has a huge some relation to my upbringing as a musician as well, because I don't know if you know the Moog, M-O-O-G. Robert Moog invented the first synthesizer, which I learned from you. You could only play one note at a time.
That's right. It was monophonic.
And back then, Walter Carlos, now known as Wendy Carlos, created an album of all Bach pieces, which at the time had to be played multi-track, like play all the way through with one note, then play all the way through with another note, put them on top of each other until you get a complicated Bach fugue or even something symphonic, played on synthesizer with these really cool sonorities, wild, whacked out kind of, at the time, 1970s culture sonorities, but the music was pure Bach. And he came out with an album called Switched on Bach, which a lot of you might know, and then the second one was called The Well-Tempered Synthesizer, which I think is hilarious. But it was through that I got to know Bach and got to know classical music, in fact. So we both had that in common, that we came to classical music from what was then something completely non-classical.
Yeah,
but
popular.
Pop music, yeah. It was great, but it's so cool that you've got a Moog synthesizer.
Yep, well, they are still marvelous instruments, and people are used to digital. Everything's digital nowadays, but in those days, the original Moog synthesizer the sound was created by oscillators. So it's a real instrument, and very temperamental, has to be constantly tuned, and as you noted, it only plays one note.
Only one at a time, which is crazy. So you need a whole bunch of them in order to play, like in real time, to play a piece with many harmonies or something. So from this musical background, you sort of, at least at first, you stayed in the Midwest, yes? And you found yourself in Wisconsin because, as you mentioned, your dad got the job in Appleton.
Yep.
And your first orchestra job was in Wisconsin as well.
Yes,
right?
with the Milwaukee Symphony. I had moved to Milwaukee, and my plan was to become a journalist, but I was having trouble getting a job, and I needed money to make ends meet. I saw an ad in the Milwaukee Journal that said, "Be a voice for the Milwaukee Symphony," and I thought, well, that sounds interesting. It sounds like marketing or something like that. And I remembered that my mother and dad had helped found the Fox Valley Symphony in Appleton years earlier, and I remembered my mom helping to draw posters and things like that to advertise it. So I think I had something like that in my mind. But it turned out to be a telemarketing job. We called something like, there was a crew of us, 20 of us, and we called something like 1 million people, asking them to subscribe to the symphony. And boy, was that good training, because I learned from the ground up how to talk to people about this music.
But then I imagine you probably also got to hear the Milwaukee Symphony quite
often. Oh yes, and that was my first professional orchestra concert, was hearing the Milwaukee Symphony, at the time conducted by Lucas Foss, very composer of note in himself, but also a conductor. And I fell in love with just the whole experience of a live orchestra concert, just something magical about it. So I knew that was what I wanted to do.
And a very good orchestra.
Yeah, it is a good orchestra.
So then from the telemarketing position, where did that lead?
Let's see. I became friends with Jerry Ferrara, who was the very eccentric and very New York Italian director of public relations of the Milwaukee Symphony, and he was looking for an assistant communications manager position. So I applied for that and got the job, and Jerry taught me basically orchestra PR from the ground up.
And you found this interesting, yes?
Oh, yeah. It was very interesting. I mean, it's just really kind of an extension of what I'd already been doing.
Well, it was, you said you wanted to be a journalist, so it includes writing, obviously, and then it was all about music, which you love.
Exactly. So, it was not something that I ever envisioned for myself. It just kind of happened, which is often the way things are in life. I
agree, and I think it's often the way things are in the orchestra administration field, because nobody... as a kid, you don't know that such a thing exists, right? Yeah.
No, and in fact, at the time, there were no degrees in arts administration. Of course, now, most of the people who are going into this are degreed. At the time, there was, the only preparation was by getting a job and starting to do it.
So then why didn't you stay at the Milwaukee Symphony for the rest of your life?
I became disenchanted with the large orchestra world. It felt like, trying to turn a battleship. It was just too hard to make change. I thought that an orchestra should be very closely intertwined with its community, and it just was too hard to make that happen.
It didn't feel that way.
It didn't feel that way. So
I was going to say that I think big orchestras in general have at least, well, there are some wonderful things, right? I mean, they have huge budgets. They can do anything that they want with with any guest artist. And the musicians can have a very close relationship because they're working together day in and day out, the same people for years. But I can think of at least 3 disadvantages. One of them is, as you said, it's really hard to change direction, right? Like turning a battleship. Another thing is because their budgets are so huge. For example, Boston Symphony's budget, I think, including their summer home at Tanglewood, is probably upwards of $100 million a year. And so then because it's so huge, all of your effort ends up going into making ends meet. And money it's strange because it's the art world, right? But money ends up becoming more important than the art sometimes. And then, another thing which I find really, really, like at the core of it, is that the musicians, when they're performing, they have to give so much of themselves. I liken it to giving birth. And you can't do that every day. But what they have in a concert week is they might do a concert 4 times, maybe 5 times, and then after that, no matter what kind of triumph it was, the next day or 2 days later, they're back at it with a different program. And so you've got to be practicing one program while you're working on another one, and it's so hard to give of yourself psychically and emotionally the way that I think should be required of real music making.
Yeah. Well, I think that's true, and I also think that with an orchestra like ours here, the West Michigan Symphony, to compare it to that, our musicians are they're all professionals, but they might go from one week playing with us to the next week doing a very different program with the Kalamazoo Symphony or Midland or Flint. I mean, all over the place. And
or doing something completely different, teaching music.
Or teaching, or playing chamber music. So they're constantly having to change gears that way in a way that I think keeps them fresh and vibrant.
I think so too. I mean, one thing that's fun is that when we see the musicians at the first rehearsal for a given concert, they're all happy to see each other.
Yeah.
Because they haven't seen each other for a month, that's very different. Anyway, so back to you. You were disenchanted with the big orchestra world.
Yeah. So as I mentioned earlier, we had a summer place in Traverse City that was actually built by my great grandfather. It's still the lodge is still standing. It was built in 1906, I think. And anyway, there's an orchestra there, the Traverse Symphony Orchestra, and it was originally a community orchestra, like this one was originally.
As most orchestras are,
and
with very few exceptions.
And it was in the process of professionalizing, just as this orchestra did, 30 or 40 years ago. And so they were looking for a new executive director. They had just hired a new music director, and I applied for that position and got it, and started in, I think it was the fall of 2001.
And you must have been thrilled to be back in Traverse City, where your place is.
It was wonderful.
Yeah.
It was wonderful, and it was wonderful to be a Michigan resident and to be able to, once again, be at an organization that was very rooted in the community and in community relationships and able to change and grow very quickly.
And a community that you love, which is really important. I think it's really important when you're making music, speaking as a conductor, to love the people that I'm making music for. You're not just doing it in a vacuum, and you know that the energy of the audience is half of the recipe of great music making.
Yeah.
So let me ask you this. How long were you in Traverse City, and what came next?
I was there 6 years, and a friend of mine that I'd known as a young conductor at the Milwaukee Symphony, Harvey Felder, was music director of the orchestra in Tacoma, Washington. And he contacted me when they were looking for an executive director and invited me to apply. I got that job in, I guess it would have been 2007. And my wife and I were feeling a little restless, and decided that would be a good adventure. So we picked up and moved out to the Pacific Northwest.
About as far as you can go
in
this country.
Exactly.
Wow. And so now that's where I met you,
yeah.
actually, because I guest conducted what was then called the Tacoma Symphony. Now it's called Symphony Tacoma.
Right.
Yeah?
Mm-hmm.
Back in 2013. And at the time, I thought a couple things. First of all, what a cool community you had put together. The board of directors, the whole ecosystem around the orchestra.
Mm-hmm.
I was really impressed. That's actually why, one reason when we found that Andy was interested in this job, I was like, get this guy here. However, it's a completely different flavor being out there. I mean, it's different landscape, different kind of mindset of the people, a lot of .com people and a lot of, Intel and stuff like that, right? And of course, it's well, like here, there's a lot of rain. But what else can you say?
It is a wonderful place, and all I can say is that I felt like a plant in the wrong pot. You know, like the soil just wasn't right. You know, and I felt that way pretty early on, but I kept thinking, well, stick it out.
You'll get used to it.
It'll start to feel like home, and that just never happened. Although I established many close friendships out there, and still have a great affection for that orchestra and for all of its people. But I knew, you know, after about 5 or 6 years, Beth and I both knew that we wanted to come back to Michigan.
Ah, interesting. So one of the things you told us, which really kind of surprised me and shocked me, is that during this whole time, you were keeping an eye on the West Michigan Symphony.
I was.
Specifically.
Yeah,
Tell us about that.
Well, you know, I had known people who had worked here, and I'd heard about the Frauenthal Center, for one thing. And one of the challenges of being ED in Traverse City was that the orchestra has no home venue. It plays at Interlochen, it plays in high school auditorium, you know, different places like that. And I knew from people who had worked here that the Frauenthal Center was just this stunning venue. And of course, I knew you were here. And once I had worked
we knew
with
each
you,
other by then.
Yeah. Once I had experienced working with you, I remember saying, you know, Scott and I have very compatible visions for what an orchestra should be. If I ever get a chance to work with him, I'm going to take it. So it was really, you know, it all came together. And I knew eventually that Carla would retire, and I would I was going to apply as soon as she did.
And here you are.
Here I am.
So that's so great. So you're back in Michigan.
Yeah.
And you feel like you're planted in the right pot now.
Oh yeah. This is great.
Beautiful.
You know, and that's the thing too, is that there's the other element of that I did not know was I did not know very much about Muskegon as a community, and I've come to really embrace this as home. I think it is a very special community. It's a community that is changing and reinventing itself really fast, and with a great deal of passion. And I'm just loving being a part of that.
And also, it's a place where the love of classical music, I think, and the arts in general, is deeply ingrained in the culture.
Yeah.
And you know, I felt that right away when coming here. You know, being a Boston boy to begin with, you know, where it is also very deeply ingrained. I had missed that some of the other places I had been, and really I feel it here, which is wonderful. Well, I'm so glad you're here.
Thank you.
Let's talk a little bit about the upcoming concert,
Sure.
because here you are, you're having lunch and learning about Andy. I'm guessing you're probably expecting to learn a little bit about the music too. So we're just going to tell you very briefly, because 2 of the 3 pieces are extremely familiar. The one that's not is by Paul McCartney. Yes, that Paul McCartney. He put together a concert not too many years ago. You know, he fashions himself as a working class boy from Liverpool, so he came up with a concert called Working Classical. And in that concert are several pieces that he wrote, not necessarily orchestrated by him. In some cases, he had them orchestrated. But there's a lovely piece called Spiral that we're going to be starting the concert with. And it's extremely atmospheric. It's easy to understand right away. And I think I'll just let you, just let you hear it, because there isn't much that needs to be described, except if you imagine, when I hear this music, I sort of feel almost this aquatic atmosphere, sort of like in Debussy's La Mer or something. There's harp, which is always used in music about the water, and there are very nice undulations that are sort of like ocean waves that you hear throughout the orchestra, especially the strings, and some fanfares and the horns that sound like the climax of La Mer to me. Now, I'm not saying at all that there's any aquatic theme here. He didn't say that. But that's what it means to me, and that's kind of what I'm bringing out in the orchestra when we put this together. So that's Spiral, and it lasts almost not much longer than I've been talking about it already. Then we have Mendelssohn Fingal's Cave Overture. That's a wonderful overture where Mendelssohn was inspired by Fingal's Cave, which is the coastline of Scotland. I'm sure maybe some of you have been there, and it's very atmospheric, and it's sort of the shifting lights and shadows, and sometimes ominous feeling that you would get being inside or right outside a cave in maybe stormy weather. Again, doesn't need too much explanation. And finally, the last piece on the concert is the last symphony that Mozart wrote, the Jupiter Symphony. We were joking earlier, well, we really wanted to do the planets by Holst. It's still not time yet that we can put a huge orchestra on the stage, right? The planets calls for an enormous orchestra. We can't quite do that because we're still distancing a little bit. So we're giving you one planet, which is Jupiter. It's a brilliant piece of music that goes without saying. It's Mozart, but it's also masterful in ways that when you watch, I will actually explain to you. The last movement of the symphony has 5 different themes that Mozart introduces to us, one after the other, patiently, very clearly delineating each of the themes. And then in an absolute masterstroke, in the coda of the last movement, this is something you might not know unless someone tells you, because it's almost impossible to discern at the moment that you're hearing it. At the very end, he plays all of the themes simultaneously. And that's just, it's like, where did this come from? You know, the people that say that Mozart's music must have been dictated from some higher source, it's because of things like this. Because you couldn't plan that out. It just has to occur to someone in a master stroke, like a bolt of lightning, to be able to play 5 themes that all work perfectly on their own, all at the same time. Just incredible, incredible.
It's a Jupiter of a symphony.
It's a Jupiter of a symphony. I think that you know about Mozart and Mendelssohn. They were both prodigies. It's possible that Mendelssohn was a better prodigy than Mozart was at a very young age. Like Mozart, he didn't get to live all that long. In addition to some amazing things like rediscovering Bach, which Mendelssohn did. Bach would have been forgotten if Mendelssohn hadn't gone and unearthed some of his things like the St. Matthew Passion and performed them again, brought them to public consciousness. So, I mean, even just for that, he should be celebrated. But he wrote music at the age of 12, 13, 14, 15, 16 that was much more advanced than Mozart did at that age. But he remained at that very high level, whereas Mozart started at a lower level and then became the sublime composer that we know him as. Fingal's Cave, Mozart, Jupiter Symphony. What a beautiful way to end the Masterworks season of the West Michigan Symphony.
Yes, the 3 M's. And, Mozart probably did not name the Jupiter Symphony. I think that was probably a title that was coined by a publisher. And it has nothing to do with the planet Jupiter, and it has nothing to do with the god Jupiter, but it is a Jupiter of a symphony, the great Jupiter Symphony of Mendelssohn.
And it's in C major, which is, sort of it's the all white keys on the piano. It's the simplest, I suppose, for a kid to play, but there's also something iconic about that. It's, it's the most basic of keys, I guess. It's like nature. That's what Strauss uses in Also sprach Zarathustra when he's trying to, at the very beginning with the kettle drums, the theme from 2001, that's in C as well. It's just something like from the earth, the original key or something like that.
Yep.
Yeah? Although it's not actually the original key. If you listen to a buzzing light, it's almost always B flat. So we think of that as the now. But he wouldn't have known that. Yeah. Is there anything you'd like to say about protocol and the way things have changed?
Well, things are changing very quickly, and we are doing our best to keep up with them. And I think, there's a lot of angst and consternation right now because people are not exactly sure what they're supposed to do and what to expect. And I think the best thing I can say to everyone is let's remember to be gracious to one another. People are still in different places as far as this pandemic goes. Some people are still very hesitant to take off their masks. Others are ready to rip them off, as we did at the very beginning of this broadcast. Let's just remember to treat one another with courtesy and patience.
That's great. And with all that said, we are creating a season next season that's going to be, really exciting, and the kind of thing where we'll want people, or people will want to crowd close together in the concert hall. Yeah.
Yes, we expect to be fully open as of November when we open the season. But the other nice thing is that we're going to continue to do the virtual concert broadcasts. So if you're a subscriber to the Symphony, you will also get to have access to all the virtual concerts. So you never have to worry about missing a concert again, even if you go to Florida for the winter.
That's a great point.
Yeah.
And I think this has been a real wonderful learning experience for us. If anything good has come out of this quarantine, it's been that we have learned, so many of us have learned, I'm sure you have too, in your own profession and in what you do, that there are different ways to do things than the way we've always done it. Mm-hmm. And sometimes it's good to be shaken up a little bit and to realize that there are new horizons out there. And I think we found some this year.
I think so too. And you hear, of course, nothing will ever replace the experience of a live symphony concert. But it's also true that you hear and see things in those broadcasts that you might not notice the rest of the time.
That is true, because you have a seat right on stage.
Yeah.
And not just right on stage, but at all the best spots on stage, because the camera, cuts from one to the other. But if there's one thing that we've learned is that, as you heard me say earlier, the energy of a concert is at least 50% from the audience. And so we love having an audience in the hall. But even if you're not in the hall, we know the character of our audience. We know you. And so we can feel you out there, even in our virtual video concerts that we've done all year. That has been what's allowed us to play these performances so well, I think.
Mm-hmm. And I think we really need to express our gratitude to the audience, to our board, and to the musicians for all of the courage and integrity that they've shown throughout this. The audience has supported us, has stayed with us, and the musicians have continued to work very hard, and the orchestra sounds terrific. I mean, they really are so full of energy and verve and vitality, and it's just wonderful.
We were scared, actually, because we were so separated, like physically separated. When you're 6 feet away from the nearest person, can you hear what's going on in the orchestra? And we've had to adjust, but that's been good because it's attuned everyone's ears, so that now when we're closer together again, it's like Technicolor or something that wasn't there before. Anyway, we're so grateful to you. The concert is this Friday. It's the 3 M's, Paul McCartney, Felix Mendelssohn, and Wolfgang Amadeus Mozart. It's at 7:30, and can't wait to see you, and can't wait for you to see us then. Thank you, Andy. This is really fun.
Yeah, this was good. We'll do this again.
We'll do this again. Thanks, everyone. Take care.
Bye.